coming out on this wet Chicago morning to hear my remarks. Let me begin by asking you if you know what the 4 stars on the Chicago flag represent. Probably most Chicago citizens don't. But this morning you're going to learn what those 4 stars mean. Fort Dearborn, the Great Fire of 1871, the 1893 Century of Progress, and the 1893 World's Fair and the 1933 Century of Progress. The City Council felt that Fort Dearborn was such an important part of our history that it designated that star on the flag to represent and commemorate the Battle of Fort Dearborn, which occurred on August 15th, 200 years ago, during the War of 1812. In the last 2 centuries, Chicago has been transformed beyond all recognition. Yet the frontier vitality that originated in the hearts and the minds of those who decided to build in the remote wilderness near the shore of Lake Michigan has endured. There is no doubt that it's been instrumental in propelling this city from a small military outpost to the capital of the American heartland. More important than merely remembering that event, however, is the opportunity afforded us to make an attempt to appreciate and understand the lives of those who explored and inhabited the region in a time long before logs were cut or concrete was poured. There's rarely a single distinct version of the past upon which everyone can agree, and that is both the challenge and the appeal of remembering an event like the Battle of Fort Dearborn. And good history is really about synthesizing all of the smaller accounts and events and understanding how they come together in a larger view of what the world was like at that time. The establishment of Fort Dearborn was by no means the beginning of the United States' official interest in this trading crossroads of the northwestern frontier. Chicago's history extends far earlier, sharing its past with the once small tribe of Potawatomi Indians who occupied extensive territory along the eastern and the western borders of Lake Michigan, including much of northeastern Illinois. After the Revolutionary War, Americans began to expand westward in larger numbers, leading to conflicts with the native tribes who were slowly and painfully pushed from their traditional villages and hunting grounds. Though the United States had gained control of the Northwest Territories from the British in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the situation on the ground was not quite so simple. The English continued to pursue their interests in the continent, refusing to cede control of their forts and dominating the fur trade with the Native Americans. The British sought to keep the natives unified against the United States and encouraged them to resist the constantly growing American demand for more territory. After years of struggle involving deadly raids, battles, and thousands of deaths, culminating in the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1794, native tribes ceded extensive territory to the United States in the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The treaty opened up the Northwest Territory to American immigration, trade, and commerce, while also ceding to the United States 16 strategic tracts of land, which included, and I quote, one piece of land 6 miles square at the mouth of the Chicago River, emptying into the southwest end of Lake Michigan, unquote, which of course would become the future site of downtown Chicago. This tract of land continued to be important in Chicago's growth throughout the years. When the Illinois and Michigan Canal was completed in 1848, the debt was to be paid through tolls and land sales. And much of that 6 square mile area ceded by the Native Americans to the United States was purchased from the federal government and secured the financing of the canal in 1871, becoming one of the few canals constructed during that period of American development that would become debt-free. After the Treaty of Greenville and the Louisiana Purchase 8 years later in 1803, the strategic value of this location was clear. The critical portage link between the Great Lakes and the Chicago River to the Des Plaines River and the Mississippi River was becoming more important than ever, and a flood of settlers arrived in the region demanding protection. The new military outposts were required to keep peace with the nation's rapidly expanding border. Secretary of War Henry Dearborn ordered Captain John Whistler, the great-granduncle of the famous painter who drew Whistler's mother, and 6 men surveyed the area and constructed a stockade to guard that important portage route. Construction of the fort was slow, regularly delayed by bad weather, illness among the troops, and a lack of proper tools and supplies. Yet Captain Whistler persevered to see the log garrison rise up just 200 yards from the shore of Lake Michigan. The location is today the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Wacker Drive, just steps from where we are this morning. Fort Dearborn became the westernmost outpost of the United States, providing local Potawatomi Native Americans with ready access to a U.S. trading post. At the same time, protection for waves of future settlers was a national goal. American claims for control over the region were a national priority. Fort Dearborn was an impressive structure of military ingenuity. The outpost was outfitted with 3 cannons, scores of muskets, and at times as many as 96 soldiers. The fort's occupants lived behind 14-foot hewn log walls topped with iron's crow feet, which were in turn surrounded by a lower second fence of saplings, creating a no man's land between the 2 wooden structures. The 9 years that followed the completion of Fort Dearborn were characterized by routine and by isolation. As in the case in many border outposts, the tiny settlement was very much a world of its own, far removed from the civilization of the East. The few means of communications that residents of Chicago had at the time were late arriving messages and rumors. If you think that our winter months can be a struggle now, imagine the utter sense of detachment that Captain Whistler and his men must have felt from November until May. The relationship between the occupants of the fort and the Native Americans was not always friendly. Clothing, tools, guns, and supplies that could be acquired through the fur trade threatened to disrupt the Indians' established way of life that had existed for hundreds of years before the arrival of settlers. While some appreciated the convenience provided by American trade goods, many others urged a return to a more traditional way of native life. As the United States continued to expand and Indian tribes felt bound by treaties and extensive land cessions, tensions grew. Ultimately, Americans and the natives were in competition for the same territory, and the fort became an ugly symbol of American dominance and insatiable appetite for territory. Tensions between the U.S. and Great Britain finally reached a boiling point as the British, who resorted to impressments in order to maintain their massive naval force, had been seizing American vessels and forcing American sailors into service on British ships. Pressure finally led to action on June 18, 1812, when President James Madison signed a declaration of war marking the beginning of the War of 1812. As the nations went to war, the Native Americans were continuously displaced by encroaching settlers and viewed this as an opportunity to preserve their vanishing way of life. On July 17, 1812, in what was the first land engagement of the war, the British captured Fort Mackinac in Michigan. When news of the defeat reached General William Hull in Detroit on July 29th, he suddenly found himself unable to guarantee protection, stores, or provisions for the residents of the remote outpost in Chicago. He wrote to Captain Nathan Held, the commander of the fort, instructing him to distribute any supplies his men could not carry among friendly natives and march his command to the safety of Fort Wayne in Indiana. The evacuation order arrived at Fort Dearborn on August 9th, carried by Winnemac, a Potawatomi chief who had maintained good relations with the American military. Warning the fort commander of the increasingly hostile perception of the Americans among the neighboring Potawatomi, he advised Captain Held that he should leave immediately to avoid a confrontation. Staging a full evacuation of the fort with no preparation was, of course, out of the question, and Captain Held began to make plans for an orderly evacuation to Fort Wayne in the ensuing days. On August 14th, when all was ready for the departure, Black Partridge, a powerful Potawatomi village leader and longtime U.S. ally, gave Captain Held yet another warning against abandoning the safety of the fort. He surrendered a friendship medal, which he wore and was presented to him after the Treaty of Fort Wayne, explaining that he could not dissuade the young warriors who were intent on bloodshed and could not remain responsible for their actions. He warned the commander to remain inside the fort. The arguments against evacuation were strong. Fort Dearborn was strategically built for defense and could withstand an attack from either British or Indian forces. The odds of successfully resisting an attack were far greater if the Americans remained behind the walls of the stockade rather than vacate the fort and seek the open prairie. Despite the earnest and logical warnings from trustworthy friends, it was too late to abandon the plan to evacuate the fort, and the retreat from Fort Dearborn began on the morning of August 15th. Captain Held was following the orders of his superior, and General Hull had been clear that an evacuation was his charge. As news of the retreat spread, hundreds of warriors, women, and children had camped out near the fort in the hopes of receiving a promised share of the stockpiled American goods. At 9 a.m. on that date, 54 soldiers, 12 militiamen, and 29 settlers began the slow march to Fort Wayne through the temporary Indian camps that now surrounded the fort. The legendary Army Captain William Wells and 30 Miami Indians served as an advance guard for the Americans. Moments into their retreat, several hundred Potawatomi warriors were sighted moving parallel to their column, eventually falling out of view behind a line of low sand dunes. Realizing that violence was imminent, the Miami warriors quickly abandoned the Americans. 2 miles south of the fort, at what today would be 18th and Prairie Avenues, the ambush was set, and the party from Fort Dearborn was surrounded. The battle lasted only 15 minutes before Captain Held was forced to surrender after being overwhelmed by a superior force estimated at 500 Potawatomi warriors. After the initial volley of shots, much of the combat was hand-to-hand, using bayonets, tomahawks, and musket butts. 35 soldiers, all 12 members of the civilian militia, 14 settlers, and approximately 15 Potawatomi warriors were killed in what became the first tragedy in Chicago's history. Among the soldiers who died during the battle was Ensign George Ronan, who was the first ever graduate of West Point to be killed in the line of duty. Ronan was described by his peers as a man of more than usual spirit and breadth of vision. And this was proven to be true by his conduct in that battle. Survivors recounted that Ronan died a hero as he fought on to protect the women and the children inside the baggage wagons, despite being mortally wounded. Overwhelmed and with no time to reload his weapon, he swung his musket at the oncoming Indians before being shot 3 times. As he made a final attempt to rise to continue his fight, an Indian warrior tomahawked him twice. The Chicago Park District honored Ronan's sacrifice by naming a park in his memory. Also killed by the Potawatomi warriors was Captain William Wells, a warrior and one-time Indian agent from Kentucky. Wells had been kidnapped and adopted into a Miami Indian family at the age of 12, earning widespread respect as a warrior who fought for both the Native Americans and for the United States. His expertise in Indian warfare served him well that morning as he shot down enemy warriors from all directions before his horse collapsed beneath him. As he lay pinned underneath the animal, bleeding heavily in the sand with the last of his ammunition spent, he was shot by approaching Indian warriors. After taking Captain Wells' scalp as a trophy, they cut open his chest in the shape of a cross and pulled out his heart. As a crowd of Indians around Wells' body grew larger and louder, they cut the heart and consumed it, hoping to imbue themselves with the valiant qualities of Captain Wells. Wells was a hero who gave his life in order to save his friends and family who were stationed at Fort Dearborn. Today, Chicago's Wells Street commemorates the man and his bravery. As the chaos of the battle led the soldiers away from the wagons, it was left to the 12-man militia to defend those wagons filled with their wives and children. Every one of the 12 was slain, each using his musket as a club in a final act of desperation against the hundreds of warriors who swarmed around them. With nothing more to stand in their way, a single Potawatomi warrior climbed into a wagon filled with children and bludgeoned all but one to death with his tomahawk. It was reported that Mrs. Corbin, the wife of a private soldier, had vowed never to be taken prisoner. Consequently, she fought until she was cut to pieces. Of the 14 civilians slain in the battle, one was Cicely, Rebecca Held's African-American servant girl, who had arrived at the fort in 1811, accompanying the captain's wife. She and her infant son were riding in the wagons with the civilian settlers when natives burst past Ensign Ronan and the militia guard, killing both Cicely and her infant child. Cicely's death offers one of the few instances in which there are verifiable records of persons held in slavery here in Chicago. Outnumbered by almost 10 to 1, the remaining Americans had a choice to fight to the death or surrender and hope for mercy. After receiving promises that the captives would be spared, a badly wounded Captain Held agreed to surrender. The agreement, of course, was quickly violated. The victorious warriors brought their captives back to the abandoned fort, past the horrific scene of slain men, women, and children. That night at the fort, they tortured to death 5 of the badly wounded soldier prisoners, possibly burning them at the stake. The next morning, the remaining captives were divided up as the natives prepared to return to their villages, and Fort Dearborn was burned to the ground. Later the next day, Billy Caldwell, the Irish Indian who also went by the name of Sauganash, arrived in Chicago. He was trusted by both Indians and Americans and was often relied upon to oversee the operation of John Kinsey's trading post. Upon his arrival, Caldwell learned that the Kinsey family was in danger from a group of 20 Indian warriors who arrived too late to participate in the battle. Yet they still desired to take part in the carnage. Caldwell, dressed completely as an Indian, quickly gathered some unoccupied natives to back him up and went to work talking down the vengeful group surrounding the Kinsey home. Taken by surprise, the Indians relented and Mrs. Kinsey and her children were saved. Billy Caldwell continued to use his bargaining skills and moderate character throughout his life. A number of years later, he was to become Cook County's first Justice of the Peace when he was selected in 1825. The Sauganash neighborhood on our city's far north side bears that name as an honor and sign of respect for Billy Caldwell. Some of the surviving prisoners eventually found their way back to civilization, either through ransom or escape, though many others died in captivity. That was the case of Mrs. Needs, the wife of one of the soldiers. She, her husband, and her child all survived the battle, only to die painfully as captives of the natives. The husband died as a prisoner in January of 1813. When the Indians became annoyed with her child's cries from hunger, it was tied to a tree and left to die of starvation and exposure. Mrs. Needs herself died soon after from cold and hunger. When a captive became too weak or too injured to travel, the tomahawk was often the solution. The area was scarcely inhabited until 1816, when the United States returned to rebuild, reportedly finding the bones of some of the battle's dead still unburied on the shoreline of Lake Michigan. Carrying on the tradition that began with the fort's original occupants, soldiers, traders, and settlers brought to the area a determination to carve out their lives. From there, through the bravery and the strength and the cooperation of Chicago's earliest settlers, the area was reclaimed and the city was born. It is the same pioneering spirit that even today continues to make Chicago the city of big shoulders and the most American of American cities. Commemorating this 200th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Dearborn permits us the opportunity to appreciate the historical significance of this event for both Chicago and our nation. We should remember the events at Fort Dearborn not through the prism of tragedy, but rather by considering the admirable evolution of our city that we have experienced in the sphere of achieving harmony among diverse communities. The racial discord that sparked the Battle of Fort Dearborn did not define Chicago. On the contrary, to the credit of our great city, and to the pleasure of her citizens, the modern metropolis of Chicago has grown into a magnificently diverse place in which to reside. Truly, the tremendous varieties of vibrant communities that comprise our city are Chicago's greatest asset and the source of our deepest civic pride. Out of the tragedy of Fort Dearborn, a conflict that arose from animosity between neighboring peoples, Chicago has overcome the challenges of her founding and has grown into a flourishing city that is the pride of our nation. Surely this is a source of deep pride as well as an occasion for great celebration. Remembering the Battle of Fort Dearborn demands that we not only recall the courage and vision of the first settlers of Chicago, but also that we appreciate the broader historical significance of this event for our city. A small frontier settlement that was once marred by this tragedy, an event born out of strife between differing neighboring peoples who distrusted one another and whose interests were at odds, has now grown into a tremendously diverse and vibrant city. The work that the Niagara Foundation performs in promoting friendship, understanding, and respect across all peoples is exactly the type of effort that has helped to make Chicago the diverse city that it is. Today's Chicago is made up of dozens of differing ethnic communities, each particular and flourishing, with distinct neighborhoods coexisting side by side. The city's diversity is a cause for celebration and a cause for pride, rather than for strife and violence. In this way, the remembrance of this bloody chapter in Chicago's history becomes not merely a recollection of an unfortunate event, but an occasion on which we ought to reflect on the impressive and commendable strides our city has achieved. How remarkable and gratifying it is to note that a city whose earliest days were marked by bloody clashes, as different groups of people struggled to live peacefully as neighbors, has now grown into this splendidly diverse city, where peoples of all origins can live free, their traditions thriving, while all contributing to the richness and strength of this great metropolis. Properly commemorating the Battle of Fort Dearborn permits us to celebrate those who lived, to commemorate those who died, and the adversity that gave Chicago the strength to grow. Just as Chicago's earliest residents were forced to work through ethnic and cultural differences in order to begin building this great city, we must continue their efforts today. I'd like to express my appreciation to the Niagara Foundation for inviting me here today and for continuing its vital work toward promoting mutual understanding and respect among all citizens. Thank you all very much for your attention.